discussion on American foreign policy. I'm glad that you've come. It's a delight to have you here. Let me pray for us as we begin our evening together. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, thank you for the chance we have to be here. We pray that you would use this evening to sharpen our thinking about the role of America in the world. Give us clarity, help us to sharpen each other's thoughts, and bless each of the presenters. Help them to speak clearly their positions, that we would be challenged and taught and instructed, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, welcome to this foreign policy panel discussion. I'm going to be the moderator for this evening. I don't know if our panelists need any introduction, but I guess we have Dr. Steve Shoemaker, Professor Delana Dura, Dr. Tom Copeland, and Dr. Bill Watson. All right. So the question before the panel tonight is, what should the role of America be regarding military intervention around the world? Okay, so what should the role of America be regarding military intervention and involvement around the world? So the format for tonight, each of the panelists are going to have up to 15 minutes to present their position. And we're going to go first starting with Dr. Watson, Dr. Shoemaker, Dr. Copeland, Professor Dura. After 15 minutes, each panelist will have 10 minutes to control the discussion, whether challenging something they've heard, responding to something they've heard, engaging in conversation with a particular panelist, back and forth, and then we will open it up and close with time for questions. So my job is mostly as the timekeeper, so I'm going to simply be watching my phone, the clock, and when each of you have 1 minute left, I will stand up. I'm mostly looking this way, but I should have balanced looks. So at 14 minutes, I will stand up, and you'll need to wrap up. If you go over 15, I'll come over to you and put my arm around you and force you back into submission. So then we'll have questions and answers. We hope to end at 8:30. So that's our schedule for tonight. So without any further introduction, we will first hear from Dr. Watson. Make sure your mic is turned on.
Testing.
No.
Testing. Okay. Thomas Hobbes, in his book Leviathan, said that life is mean, in the state of nature, is mean, nasty, brutish, and short. A state of nature before there is government, and therefore we need government to keep order. Our world, we don't have a world government. I guess we have the UN, but they're not much of a world government. And would they really save us from nuclear proliferation, imperialism, massive Armageddon, who knows? No, they wouldn't. What we need is a global hegemon. If you've read anything by Neil Ferguson, he said, it has to be a global benign hegemon, not a global mean hegemon. How's that? In other words, he said in 19th century, Britain was that hegemon. The British Navy ruled the seas. The British Navy stopped the slave trade. The British Navy, the British pound was the glory of the world. Do you ever see Mary Poppins? As the pound stands, so stands England. Something happened in World War I. Britain took a major hit and could no longer continue to be the world's policeman, manage the seas. What happened? There was no global hegemon. What happened? Japan started spreading across East Asia and the Pacific. The League of Nations did nothing about it. Mussolini took Albania, and then Greece, well, he needed a little help from Germany with Greece. Albania, and then he had a little bit of trouble with Ethiopia, but he thought he would try to take Africa. And of course, what did Hitler do in Germany? Remilitarized the Rhineland, which he wasn't supposed to do. Everybody said, oh, you're not supposed to do that. He did it. And then the Anschluss with Austria. And then he said, I want the Sudetenland. And when they said, okay, Chamberlain flew and met with Mr. Hitler and returned and said, I've promised peace in our time. This paper Hitler signed, he will only take the Sudetenland. He won't take anything else. A couple weeks later, the Nazis marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then they went for Poland. Nobody was stopping them. You say, well, where was America? We were isolationist. It was none of our business. We didn't want to send our boys over to Europe. The other countries, nobody did anything. Hitler got stronger and stronger and stronger. Of course, then at the end of World War II, America did take its responsibility in the world. Of course, it was a bipolar world with US and USSR. But by the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was only one global hegemon. Our Navy ruled the seas. Instead of the pound being the glory of the world, keeping the economic ship afloat, it was the US dollar. And instead of London being the financial capital of the world, now New York City was the financial capital of the world, and Wall Street was keeping really the entire world economy going. America was that global hegemon. What's neat is that English is a world language now because we had a century of Britain, now a century of America as the global hegemon. Now, if we are no longer the global hegemon, someone else will be. If we decide to withdraw from the world, which has been happening under the Obama administration, and I'm not sure about the Trump administration. He tends to be an isolationist too, at least economically. If we do not fulfill our obligation, in fact, Tony Blair said, destiny put you, America, in this place in history. The task is yours to do. Only America can do it. The UN can't do it. France can't do it. Who's able to do it? We're the only ones able to keep world peace. You say we shouldn't be the world's policeman. The world needs a policeman. What keeps your speed down on the freeway? Because you're a Christian? Or because there's a cop that could be hanging around on that next on-ramp, checking out with their, finding out how fast people are going. The world needs a global policeman, and there's only one country that can do it. And if we don't do it, and China starts doing it, or Russia starts doing it, I don't think that they will be a benign hegemon. Think about that. Or if there's a global caliphate, who will stop the next caliphate? ISIS sprung up. And during the Obama administration, we hardly did anything. What happened to ISIS? This past year, they have been crushed. Obama wasn't the president. China is now flexing its muscles in the South China Sea, creating islands where there were no islands before. In fact, many of those were just like, shallow areas that were claimed by the Philippines, claimed by Vietnam. One of them, a few rocks where Vietnamese fishermen would stop every once in a while. China was never there. Now, all of a sudden, China decides to claim the whole South China Sea, building islands, fortified islands. And of course, now they're claiming that they have a certain many miles from these islands because it's now, in other words, and so now the sea lane through the South China Sea is no longer a sea lane because it's monitored by the Chinese Navy, the Chinese Army, and they don't want anyone going through it, blocking the major sea, really one of the largest sea lanes of the world, the South China Sea. How do you get from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific? South China Sea. And now China has a stranglehold. And what, can Vietnam stop them? The Philippines? They're all asking us to help. Should we just say, none of our business? What about Russia and Iran have this alliance to really take over the Middle East? We've withdrawn from the Middle East. And as withdrawing, now we have Iraq, which is controlled by Iran, Shiite governments, and then next door is Syria with another Shiite government, which is a pawn of Iran and Russia, and then if you go all the way over to the Mediterranean to Lebanon. So there's a chain from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, and it's all controlled by a Russian-Iranian axis. And it scares the heck out of me. Christian college, I can't say hell. Oh, sorry. And the thing is, Russians on the, maybe it brings out the dispensationalist in me, but Russians on the border of Israel with Iran, who has threatened to destroy the little Satan, Israel, and the big Satan, America. In fact, Iran, really their goal is to nuke both Israel and America. How easy would it be for them once they get nukes? In fact, John McCain recently said that if Iran gets nukes, it will be Armageddon. Are you ready? Or are you hoping for the rapture instead? Anyway, what about North Korea? North Korea already has nukes. All they need now is missiles that are good enough to reach America. And every time they test a missile, they tested another one today, by the way. Did you hear about that? Every time they test a missile, it gets a little better. They're now able to go about halfway across the Pacific. They're about within range of Hawaii. But we're not going to worry. It's really none of our business. We're not going to try to stop North Korea because that would cause a war. Maybe we should wait until they nuke Honolulu. Not too much further from Honolulu from their range is Seattle. Oh, well, Seattle's full of liberals. We can let that one go. Maybe we should wait until they nuke us and then we turn them into a parking lot. But should we? Nuclear proliferation. We're supposed to make sure that countries don't get nukes. The more countries that get nukes, the closer we are to that Armageddon. Who's going to stop Iran from getting nukes? Okay, so Obama made a deal that they wouldn't get nukes. Jimmy Carter made a deal with North Korea that they wouldn't get nukes, and guess what they did? They lied. Is Iran going to keep their promises? I don't trust them. Who's going to stop them? The UN? No, all they do is pass resolutions about how horrible Israel is and ignore all the other genocides and horrors around the world. I've lost my faith in them. I used to be a good liberal that really loved the UN. Should we be abandoning our friends, Israel, for example? Right now, we're in the midst of abandoning the Kurds. The Kurds have been our biggest supporters in the Middle East, who helped us again, in Iraq, in Iran, and the Kurds have been trampled on by every other country, every other region there. And we're now about to cut off aid to the Kurds. And they've always stood by us. If we don't stand by our friends, we're not going to have any friends. We could say, it's really none of our business. One of the reasons why I take this position is because I'm Jewish on my mother's side. And all of her extended family were lost in the Holocaust. We haven't found anybody on my mother's side of the family that survived the Holocaust. I was at a Night to Honor Israel at Faith Bible recently, and they said, if you're a descendant of a survival of the Holocaust, stand up. I couldn't stand up because no one survived. I mean, my mom and her brother and her folks, they came to America. The rest were still in that village. I went to find that village, and everybody in that village was machine gunned into a ditch. Everybody in that village was machine gunned into a ditch. I promised my grandfather, he died before the end of the Cold War, but after the end of the Cold War, I was able to get a Fulbright scholarship and go back to Moldova, where the village was that my mother's side of the family lived. And I found out that there was a Gentile town nearby, and they said, oh, that Jewish shtetl that was over there. In 1941, the Germans came in, lined them all up against a ditch and machine gunned everyone, every man, woman, and child. Genocide. If you ever have been to Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, any of those death camps in Germany, in Europe, that the Nazis built, there's a sign, usually a memorial, and all those memorials have the same thing: never again, in about 10 or 12 languages. Never again. We should make a pledge that never again will there be a genocide. Well, in the Clinton years, there was a genocide in Uganda. No, sorry, Rwanda. Rwanda. Did we do anything about it? The UN was actually there. What did the UN do when the genocide was starting? They withdrew everybody and allowed the genocide to take place. I don't think the UN is going to solve the problem. What we need is a global hegemon who tells everybody, if you commit genocide and kill millions of people, we're going to kick your butts. Oh, I did say a bad word, sorry. If there's a dictator who has, what about Saddam Hussein, who used weapons of mass destruction in Halabja, which was a Kurdish city not far from Sulaymaniyah, not too far from the Iranian border, and he gassed the entire city with poisonous mustard gas. There were pictures of bloated mothers holding their babies, dead. We didn't do anything about it until finally it reached critical mass. After Saddam Hussein was harboring terrorists, Abu Abbas and Abu Nidal were two of the most notorious terrorists. When we went in to stop Saddam Hussein, actually Abu Abbas, before we got to him, someone put a bullet through his brain. I guess they didn't want him caught so he could talk. But we did get Abu Nidal and catch him. But they were some of the greatest terrorists living in luxury in a country that aided terrorism. There should not be any country that gives safe haven to terrorists. Because when they do, the first thing they do is they set up a caliphate. And there, what do? They attract young radical Muslims from around the world who come for training. And after training, they're either fighting there or they could be sent back to their home countries as trained terrorists and bomb makers. I'm confident that in America alone, there are people like that just waiting for the signal to wreak hell in our country. You say, oh, Watson, you're just a scaremonger. These things aren't going to happen. Well, in a couple years, you can say Watson was crazy, or you say, whoa, Watson knew what he was talking about. Peace and stability are in American interests. When America does not promote the international order, the world is unstable. In that period, in the early 20th century, when there was no global hegemon, the dictators ran wild. Now we've withdrawn from the world, and Iran and Russia and China are running wild, and they have nothing to fear from us because we're not going to do anything about it. He's standing up. Oh, no. We must be able to project power. Soft power, sticky power. I would say hard power. We need a military that says, if any dictator starts massacring their citizens, we'll be there. Into the global commons to support free governments, free trade, keeping the sea lanes free, keeping the flow of oil from the Persian Gulf. You say, well, you're just doing it for the oil. Actually, America doesn't get any oil out of the Persian Gulf anymore. All that oil goes to China and Japan, and mainly Asia and Africa and Europe. Of course, if they don't get oil, what happens to our economy? Freedom of the seas, especially the South China Sea. Who deters to aggression? Who promotes human rights around the world? Our mission in Afghanistan and in Iraq was not about self-defense. Was about self-defense, should I say. What starts in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. If we allow it to start in the Middle East, it spreads here. And we have to nip it in the bud, and you want me to shut up now.
I give up. There's no chance. What's that?
Want me to click through it?
Let me just see if it works. Good. All right, thank you, Dr. Watson. All right, this should be fun. So for those who haven't had me yet, I'm Dr. Shoemaker, and I teach in the politics department here. I'm really impressed with how much Dr. Watson was able to sneak in there. I'm going to do my best. Here's a confession, though. I can only assert these things, right? I want to give you the big picture, understand the principles, and then you can always come back later on with further questions from you and further comments later on in the presentation. But just to let you know I'm not proving anything. I am just stating these things, trying to get you as much information as possible. So, one of the reasons why this is such an important topic is it's actually very divisive among conservatives. Some people think that conservatives want a very strongly interventionist policy, and that liberals are the ones that don't. And part of what I want to do today is show you that there's actually a very strong resistance to this view of military intervention that is a very respectable and very strong conservative root system. So here's a man who's a conservative who's arguing against this position, and he reminds us that this generation really doesn't understand that this really is conservatism, all right, this critique. So he says here, what do conservatives believe in? Well, if you think about it today, conservatives seem to believe in war, right? They regard it highly not only as a means for defense, but also as a tool for molding the world in America's image. The irony is that war is inherently unconservative. If you were alive 7 years ago, the one defining thing that would mark you as a conservative would be your absolute resistance to go meddling in military matters overseas. That would be the defining characteristic. And it's only in the last few decades that this has really changed. And so I want to share with you some of these ideas. All right, just to cut to the chase, this is basically our current U.S. grand strategy. And we can call it the benevolent global hegemony approach, or you can call it the moralistic interventionism. And I just want to lay out my main point right from the beginning here. It sounds great. It sounds heroic. It sounds like it's responding to real needs in the world. But in reality, it's a failed agenda. It's demonstrated to have been a failed agenda. And not only that, we should expect it if you understand human nature. If you understood what traditional conservatives believed for centuries, and even if you understand, although I don't want to get into it at great length because I don't want to drag the Bible in as a trump card, but if you even understand the worldview of the Bible, you'll see that this is a foolish agenda. It sounds like a great agenda, sounds like it's a high and noble agenda. It's actually a failed agenda, and you should expect it to be a failed agenda, all right? So here, let's just start with some very practical questions. Should we, oh, sorry, thanks. We good? Yeah. So let's just start with some concrete issues here, because you can throw around these general ideas about how we need to be responsible, or we need to be careful, or we need to be benevolent, but just some specific questions here. Should we initiate preventive war? Start a war so that you don't have a war in the future? Obviously not. Okay. Should we engage in regime change? Go in and say, we do not like those people. They're nasty. They're in charge. We need to get rid of them. Right? Yes or no? Do we do that or do we not? Do we replace and supplement other nations' militaries? Do we do that? We should be able to come up with arguments that would allow us to stand firm one way or the other on this. Should we provide military aid? Should we hold our allies accountable for their actions? Which we don't. We're really bad with this. Should we require their good behavior? Right now, we're funding Saudi Arabia, who's supposedly one of our allies. We're funding their massive destruction of the country of Yemen. It's the largest human rights crisis that we have in the world today. And we're sitting back, and we have all this grand language about having, being a hegemon and being helpful in the world. And in reality, we're funding Saudi Arabia's destruction of hundreds of thousands of women and children in Yemen. So, yes or no, right? Should we have exact economic sanctions, enforce embargoes? I'm going to say just up front that all sounds good, but I'm going to say no on all those except for holding your allies accountable. There are things we can do, all right, which because of lack of time here I'm not going to go into. I'm not saying we should do nothing, but there are certain things that we should not do, and the world will actually be a better place for it. All right. Okay, so why is this? In a snapshot, all right, this all sounds great, but it is extremely costly in terms of money, treasure, and human lives. Thank you. Good job. All right. It's very costly. And the fact of the matter is we have over $20 trillion in debt. And people who use these high-minded statements about how we need to help the world have yet to explain to me how this is all paid for. I would like to see everybody who wants this kind of a foreign policy established to get a monthly bill. I think that would put some reality into the whole thing. It's not effective, especially when we're talking about regime change. You're talking about trying to build complex computers with sledgehammers. It doesn't work that way. Human societies are far more complex than a computer, and we think military is the proper tool to go in there and just solve things. It's very naive. It's very counterproductive. Over and over again, everywhere we've gone, you're talking about Libya, you're talking about Iraq, you're talking about Syria, everywhere we go to solve these problems, we multiply our enemies. We destabilize the region. We have probably destroyed European civilization. With all the immigration, this is probably a tipping point. And so it's very counterproductive. It's also highly deceptive. It stirs your passions, gets you very excited. But in reality, our government uses this kind of language and this kind of philosophy in a very selective way. So Saddam Hussein is our partner in the Middle East as long as he's going after Iran. He gets a little uppity and it's time to take him out. All of a sudden, he's the worst human being in the world and we have to go in there and destroy his country. Saudi Arabia, they are our allies in that region. They're horrible. They're more terrorists. They are a terrorist-supporting country, and they're our allies, right? They're destroying Yemen, and they're our allies, and nobody cares. All of this high-minded talk about, protecting people and all that, it doesn't apply unless it applies, and it only applies under these secretive reasons, from the perspective of those in power. The other thing about this is, and I want to be light on the theology, but I think at its heart, I think this particular view of the world is actually contrary to the worldview that I see in the Bible. I don't see anything in the Bible that says human beings need to take charge of the world and run it, right? It's in its very essence godless. It says God cannot take care of this world. And so therefore, there needs to be a human institution. I think it's Babel, right? Not babbling, but the Tower of Babel. It's the same theology. It's the same philosophy. It's a human attempt to control this world for the sake of your own advantage. And I think it's at its root, it really does believe that there is no God in this world. Now, you might get a rapture to get a parachute, out of that, but I think so. All right, quickly here, how much time do I have? As I said, there's way too much here. 6 minutes. I will race. Let me just make some suggestions for you, all right? I think there are biblical foundations, and I'm going to spend the least time on this because I think you have to kind of see a lot of information that we're not used to looking at in the Old Testament to see that the Old Testament is really politically charged. The insights there aren't just ethical, they're not just spiritual, they really are politically charged because in God's redemptive plan, Israel had to be a nation in a very difficult part of the world for centuries. So they had to have insight in these matters. So we'll talk about that. I want to also give you some insights into historic conservatism. And I also want to talk a little bit about philosophic realism, which is my particular perspective on foreign policy. I think once you take those things into consideration, you'll see that being realistic about the nature of the world, the fact that it's full of dangers, all these things that Dr. Watson so eloquently stated, that actually drives you to be restrained in the way that you interact in the world, militarily. Okay, real quick, as I said, human nature, the state, warfare, empire, I think there's a theology of each of these with respect to political insights in the Old Testament. It's very rich, it's very coherent, it all fits together really well. And none of it points towards all of us trying to take control of this world and make it safe for democracy, all right? It's just not there, it pushes against it. Human nature careens between chaotic violence and obsessive control, and war exacerbates that, makes it horrible. The state, if you study it in the Old Testament, it leans towards being predatory. It leans towards being lawless. And when you centralize power, this is what you actually get. You don't get benevolent policemen on the corner. You get predatory, lawless governments. Think of Tower of Babel and the negative connotation there. The Bible has clear understandings of warfare. If you look at Deuteronomy, understand that Deuteronomy is actually a political covenant. I'm sorry, it's a political constitution. You'll see that there are clear restrictions on the state or the king with respect to warfare. The Constitution in Deuteronomy is very leery about warfare. It does not see it as a very useful means of bringing about peace in the world. And certainly God did give Israel that kind of agenda to be a glorious hegemon. There's also an extensive biblical theology of empire. The origins of empire are detailed in Genesis. For the most part, empires are seen as self-deluded, self-deceived beasts. They always think they're glorious, right? Think of Daniel 2. They think of themselves as gold, silver, right? Glorious statues to be worshipped. From God's perspective, they're beasts, right? They're predatory beasts that do a lot of harm when they think they're doing really well. Historic conservatism. Most people don't believe this, but the reason why you could be tagged as a conservative with your wanting a restricted, restrained foreign policy is because they believed that war is the greatest threat to liberty and war is the greatest threat to traditional values and traditional institutions. It's interesting how this has gotten flip-flopped, but war means debt. It means inflation. It means centralized power. It means running over civil liberties. This is what it means to be perpetually at war. All right? And we can't forget that government, it's big government. Big government is socialism, right? Just because it's our favorite kind of socialism doesn't mean it's not socialism. It's bureaucratic, it's selfish, it's inefficient, it's all these things, right? It's still government, even though it's in the one branch. And it has those characteristics. It's a tradition. This is really hard to say because I don't want to be critical of soldiers and be anti-patriotic. But we need to understand this. If you're for soldiers, you need to be anti-war. You need to be anti-war. War is anti-family. It's very destructive of families. It's very destructive of children. They live their lives with only one parent most of the time. It's very anti-civilization. It is morally corrosive, and it's psychologically extremely damaging. If you go through and look at the demographics among soldiers, there's a higher rate of addictions, a higher rate of abuse, a higher rate of domestic abuse, higher rate of suicide. It's very clear. It's very taxing. And so to just say, oh, well, somebody has to run the world and it's got to be really us, doesn't take this into consideration. Real quickly, this is from Thucydides and Sun Tzu, two of my great guys here. All right? This is the world. War, unpredictable, costly, devastating. War, necessary, not noble. War, better off, not winners. States aren't crazy, right? They're not irrationally evil beings. They're not. They have national interests that they pursue, and we can think that through. Our policy should be about managing conflicts, not eliminating evil. We should be concerned about building our power, but not spending it, all right? And we should be evaluating these things in terms of consequences of our policy, not the intentions of our policies, all right? Am I going to get hammered? There you go. Thank you very much.
Well, good evening, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation tonight. I'll apologize in advance. I've had laryngitis for a week, and so my voice is really froggy and hard to listen to, so my apologies for that. I worked in Washington, D.C. for about 10 years. I worked for the U.S. Navy, for LexisNexis. I worked on Homeland Security projects, and at the Institute of World Politics, a graduate school of international relations. And so I spent a lot of time studying international relations, and I've been teaching it for almost 15 years. And those of you who have had me in class know I like playing devil's advocate. I like to challenge students to rethink their views. But tonight I find myself in the unusual and uncomfortable position of needing to articulate publicly what my own personal position is on U.S. military intervention. So it's been a useful exercise. And here it is. This is my position. I'm trying to keep it simple, right? 2 plus 2. I think there are 2 philosophical or theological principles and 2 practical principles that are important in deciding about American military intervention overseas. So first, a philosophical and theological principle. And sorry for the colors. I believe it's the role of the church to speak into public debates about military intervention by explaining the long Christian tradition of just war theory. Beginning with Augustine and expanded by Thomas Aquinas, among many others, just war theory holds that there can be a moral case for going to war, what is called jus ad bellum, a Latin phrase. The first and most important principle of just war is that there must be a just cause, a right reason for going to war. And that usually means self-defense or defending others from aggression. No war must also be a last resort, after all other practical means of resolving the conflict have been exhausted. There must be a reasonable chance of success, of actually impacting the wrong of the situation. And the universal goods resulting from applying military force must be proportional to the universal evils that result, including casualties. But just war theory is not a checklist of what to do, but a set of ethical principles that should guide the thinking of political authorities, and the church should be advocating for and explaining just war theory. Now, the U.S. military implicitly follows a second set of rules that are part of just war theory, particularly in how it fights wars, what are called jus in bello requirements of proportional force, no intentional targeting of civilians, proper treatment of prisoners, and so forth. Now, there are exceptions to these. Think of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam and Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. But those exceptions prove the rule that the U.S. military abides by ethical principles in its conduct of war. The second philosophical principle is one that is probably less familiar to many here, and that is the idea of just order, or what Augustine called tranquillitas ordinis, the peace created by a just political order. Catholic theologian George Weigel describes this as a quest for ordered liberty in an evolving structure of international public life, capable of advancing the classic goals of politics: justice, freedom, order, the general welfare, and peace. In other words, this is a Wilsonian view of American foreign policy, advocating the spread of democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. Now, in many cases, this can be accomplished through non-military means. But Weigel argues further that there may be situations where a wrong has not been done directly to the United States, but in order to maintain a just order, we're morally accountable for acting in the face of great evil, even acting with the use of force. Now, critics will contend that the U.S. is not the world's policeman, that our national interests need to be more narrowly defined. However, if God's commands are universally applicable to all people at all times, then the command to love our neighbor cannot be ignored. Love of neighbor requires us to act on behalf of the victims of aggression. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 13, the government bears a sort of justice to be diakonos, ministers, deacons for our good. Doing justice is an act of service. And while a government's duty is first to its own people, it cannot ignore the command to love our neighbors as ourselves, to do justice and to love mercy. Furthermore, we can and should expect secular governments to do this. God held secular rulers like Pharaoh and Nebuchadnezzar and Darius to account. In Psalm 2, we are told that the Father has given the nations of the earth to the Son as his possession. The rulers of the earth are told to be wise, to serve the Lord with fear, or they will be broken with a rod of iron. God clearly expects secular rulers to obey his commands. So I believe that the U.S. government has a duty to love our neighbors, to defend the poor, the fatherless, and the widow, to bear the sword of justice against those who transgress the tranquilitas ordinus, the peace of a justly ordered society. Now, lest critics suggest that I'm advocating an unlimited role in the world for the U.S. military, let me turn from philosophy to two somewhat more practical principles. First, prudence. Now, as I said a moment ago, I believe that the church should be informing public debate about military intervention. But it is always the case that the decisions of whether to go to war and how to fight it are the domain of public officials. While I would pray that the president and his advisors would pay heed to the requirements of just war theory, at a minimum, I hope that they will act with prudence. Now, prudence is a lovely word, meaning the application of wisdom, justice, common sense, and caution. It's not quite a circular definition of itself, but almost. So what do I mean when I say the president should be prudent about military intervention? Well, he should listen carefully to his top military advisors, who have a wealth of experience and knowledge, as well as to the people's representatives in Congress. He should listen to the advice of friendly countries, bearing in mind that their interests still may not be ours. He should weigh the short-term costs and benefits against the long-term, and assess whether a greater good will come from intervention. In other words, he should consider history, proportionality, public opinion, and the likelihood of actually serving the greater good. But prudence should not be used to mitigate the call to action that is required by tranquilitas ordinus, by the call to a just order. Prudence is not waiting for North Korea to launch a nuclear missile. Prudence is not waiting for a genocide to play itself out before we get involved. Prudence is not waiting for Hezbollah to rain down thousands of rockets on Israel. There may be better or worse ways of dealing with these problems, and they may not require military intervention right away. But we should not let an overabundance of caution or fear deter us from using military force when necessary. The second practical principle is the importance of public diplomacy. If we want our government to avoid the necessity of using military force too often, we should encourage it to use all means at its disposal. Public diplomacy is striving to speak directly to the public in other countries to influence citizens and their governments. Sometimes this takes the shape of public information campaigns, what you might call propaganda, through international broadcasting like Voice of America, and social media. But much of the time, public diplomacy involves people-to-people connections through culture and education. The idea is to build up political capital with allies and potential allies, and even to take the edge off the animosity of our opponents. Unfortunately, the United States only spends about $2 billion each year on public diplomacy, about 3.5% of the annual budget for the State Department. So I believe it's an area of foreign policy that needs a lot more attention. So let me just recap briefly. I believe the church should advocate for just war theory as a guide to military intervention, with the added concern for just order, or tranquilitas ordinus, which should motivate us to act on behalf of the oppressed. But the ultimate decision to deploy military force is the province of political leaders, who should use prudence in all cases and public diplomacy where possible to prevent the need for military operations. I look forward to the verbal bomb throwing that follows this.
Oh, yes, thanks. Okay, I don't know if I can do this sitting. I'm going to try. We'll see. Well, this is really a pleasure, so thank you for inviting me to do this. I am the non-political scientist, non-historian on the panel. I have a background in economics, obviously, for those of you I've seen in class before, but also in international affairs and in the Middle East. I am also a recovering neoconservative. So, and I say that with great respect because I have great respect for my colleagues on the panel. But this has been a very personal journey for me. So we all know the picture in the background. That was a very personal day for me. I was working in downtown Manhattan when the World Trade Center was attacked. So I have vivid memories of that day. And that's actually what really sparked my desire to be part of something bigger, to bring peace to places that were troubled and tragic and were sending their angry young men to take down buildings with airplanes and things like that. And so I definitely became a very strong promoter of war to bring peace. And actually, just north of where the World Trade Center, original World Trade Center used to stand, is a military recruiting office, and I spent many hours in the naval recruiting office trying to get myself into the Navy so that I could learn Arabic, so that I could bring peace to the Middle East via war. But I didn't do that, and God had different plans. So I'm now in a very different position. Most notably, I am probably the only avowed pacifist on the panel who has great respect for the role of the state in the world, but also I have a greater desire to do the things. I'm going to try not to double what Dr. Shoemaker was giving you, but I have great desire to do the things that Christ wants us to do first, and I don't want to be distracted from those things. So that's my personal take on this story. However, I was very much so seduced by the desire to have the American military be part of the world. There was a country song that got really popular after 9/11, and it had a phrase in it, I'm not gonna quote it exactly, but something about putting the US military boot into certain regions of other countries that was really gonna hurt. And I was so excited about that at the time. So there's a lot of seduction. One of the reasons is actually just an overconception or an exaggeration of what American interests are in the world, and my colleague has already done some of that work, so I'm just gonna move right past that. The idea that it's up to us. And I think Dr. Watson's really, I think you encapsulated that philosophy really well. I think we often think it is up to us. If we don't do X, whatever it is, no one else will, so we best do it. I think that's very seductive. Patriotism, or even, unfortunately, nationalism can really drive us to that. And I used to, I could cry at the national anthem like the best of them. And also, I think sometimes a misunderstanding of what Paul is saying in Romans 13, that perhaps we have made it more prescriptive than descriptive. That yes, the state bears the sword, that may not be our role though. All right, so first of all, I now don't think that war brings peace. I think war is the opposite of peace. Thus, I would like the US military to do no intervening in the world because I don't think it brings more peace for us or for others. In fact, along with the economists that I tend to like a lot, I think war is destruction. I think it's economically destructive. I think it's destructive in terms of human life. So for those of you who've been through Econ 215, at some point you learned that intervention and or coercion in the economy is a bad thing. No good. You're not supposed to do it. I take that same principle and I apply it to foreign policy, and I say that intervention and or coercion in terms of the sovereign affairs of other nations is not good. Sometimes it looks good in the short run. For those of you who had to read Bastiat's The Law, sometimes it really looks like you're doing good when you redistribute wealth and you use it to help poor people, but unfortunately, it has long-term unintended consequences. From one of my favorite Austrian economists comes this quote from Ludwig von Mises: "War is harmful, not only to the conquered, but to the conqueror. Peace builds, war destroys." Economically considered, war and revolution are always bad business. And I use that last little bit just to remind you from the economist's perspective that though there is a common mythology out there that it was World War II that got the US out of the Great Depression, it's actually really not true. It can be short run very nice to go to war because you build things. You make a lot of bullets and bandages and planes and tanks and trains and all those things. But they're not a long-term sustainable thing for an economy. They're elements of destruction. So they only help you in the short run. So let me give you a couple perspectives from the Middle East. I'll tell you a few little quick stories here. And these are the various follies that we and or some of our allies have conducted in the Middle East that I think are good case studies for why we should not try to bring peace through war. Maybe some of you know about the map that was drawn in the Middle East near the end of World War I. A man named Mark Sykes and a man named Francois Picot drew a map of the Middle East, the former Ottoman Empire, which was basically losing at that point. They were gonna be the losers in World War I. And France and Britain got together and said, well, we gotta figure out how to divvy up the spoils of war. Essentially, we gotta figure out who's gonna run that place, because I mean, they've been under Ottoman rule all this time, they don't know how to rule themselves. So they drew this map. Now, to be fair, the map didn't completely hold. There was a little bit, there was definitely some adjustments after the war, but Area A is what we now consider Syria and Lebanon, and that was meant to be under the protection of France, and Area B is the current Palestine and Israel and Jordan and Iraq, and that was going to be under the protection of Britain. And that is what happened after the war. Neocolonialism. No wonder there is anti-US and anti-British and anti-European sentiment there. We just drew borders that worked with a ruler. That's not good. So then a few years later, Americans, being much more enlightened, decided that they, of course, had to make sure that we protected American interests. And though I would definitely agree that our current escapades in the Middle East are very little to do with oil, there was a time when we definitely thought access to oil was extremely important to the American national interest. And so in the early 1950s, a democratically elected prime minister in Iran decided to nationalize, along with his parliament, decided to nationalize the Iranian oil company, which was at that time heavily supplying the US and Britain. The US and Britain did not like that. So the US CIA and the British MI6, both spy agencies, if you will, they colluded to overthrow the democratically elected prime minister and reinstate the power of the Shah. The Shah was not well loved in Iran. The Shah was difficult to love. He was loved by a few, but he wasn't loved by the poor for the most part. He liked to fly in fresh caviar every day. So it's hard to love a guy like that. And the US actually propped up that particular Shah. Wasn't the worst dictator in the world, but wasn't a great one either. For several decades, through the course of the 1970s, funded $20 billion in arms buildup in Iran. But the Shah, again, not very loved, was overthrown in 1979 by the Ayatollah Khomeini. And suddenly Iran was now our enemy, with a recent $20 billion purchase of US weapons, everything but nukes, by the way. So in attempting to protect our American interests, we ended up arming what soon became an enemy. But then, because of the Cold War, we also had an interesting policy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend idea. The problem is that enemyship and friendship are both fickle. So in the 1970s, we had funded Iran's weapons. In the early 1980s, Iran and Iraq went to war, and we didn't want Iran to beat Iraq. And even though we didn't really like Iraq very much because they were actually kind of Marxist, they had been kind of pro-USSR, we didn't like them very much, but we decided that we wanted to make sure they didn't lose. And so we but we sold them $56 billion worth of arms over the course of the 1980s so that they could fight Iran. But interestingly, at that same time, you may have heard of this thing called the Iran-Contra affair. We also, through the Israelis, also sold some arms to Iran in the same period so that they could fight Iraq. Are you seeing the confusion here? So on the right is actually a map of Afghanistan, and in the 1980s we also funded a whole lot of arms as well as training and a lot of intelligence and some other things to the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were the holy warriors of Afghanistan, and they were trying to repel Soviet invaders all through the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Soviets were our enemies. The Afghanis were enemies of the Soviets. That made the Afghanis our friends. So we funded their war. But near the end of the 1980s, an anti-US faction in the Mujahideen, who later came to be called the Taliban, decided that they didn't really want to work with the US anymore and started to train their Mujahideen soldiers to eventually fight the United States. They practiced on the USS Cole and a few other things, and eventually we had 9/11, which is my personal story. So this enemy is my friend. This intervention has never been well thought, and we haven't really thought through the consequences. We're often bound to repeat history. You can't see that well, but we spent about $800 billion in the last 16 years in Afghanistan. We spent about $800 billion in an over-decade war in Iraq to depose a dictator. 100,000 plus people are dead in Afghanistan because of the war. Over 500,000 people dead in Iraq. That's economic power. That's human power. Those are souls. It's just messy. And I fear we have done no good in any of that. I know the modern question now is, what do we do with Syria? Well, the reality is we don't really know. There's a lot of factions. So just to have fun with it, the rebels, and there's at least 10 different factions of rebels, they've got a whole bunch of different allies. And then the Syrian government has a whole bunch of different allies, which now also makes us at another proxy war with Russia. It's the 1980s all over again. So in the United States, history in the Middle East, I think, is proof positive that we actually don't know how to do this well. Even if there were a moral case for military intervention, there is no good way to do that. This goes back to what we talk about in economics, that the price system is kind of awesome in part because it doesn't rely on any one group of people to be smart enough to know how to price anything. We're just not smart enough. And we've gotten so used to using military power, as Dr. Shoemaker said, that if you have a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. We've stopped being creative. We've stopped using our imagination. So I think I don't have very long. So let me be fast. I do want to offer a couple other options. If we're not going to always militarily intervene when really bad things are happening, what are our options? Well, first, I think we've got to have a posture of kingdom people. I mean, in this room, I'm talking to the brothers and sisters in the body of Christ, and so I think we have to think the kingdom first. I have an author that I really like. His name is Randy Harris, and he often says, you are in the kingdom of God, and the kingdom of God is never in trouble. So start there. Perfect love casts out fear, John says. So we don't have to be fearful. I'm not saying there aren't scary things, because there are, and we still have to do stuff about them. I think we have to think humbly. And so I do think that that's an important thing, and I think we have to be honest about what we know and what we don't know, and let's not be empire-minded. I did pull this quote from the beginning of the Heritage Foundation's Index of U.S. Military Strength, and it said this, and I was actually kind of struck at how firmly worded this was. Above all else, America's armed forces exist so that the U.S. can physically impose its will on an enemy. Now, I mean, I get it. When you have an enemy, you would like to win. That's some pretty strongly worded language. I don't know. Maybe we got to rethink where's our posture. I think we need to acknowledge the agency of others. Compassion does not mean condescending pity. We have to value self-determination. If you think of our own American history, we really value that we chose to be independent. And we did that without anyone saying, oh, those poor little American colonists. We feel so bad. Let's raise money for them and help them and pat them on the head. We didn't do that. We need to value that self-determination in others, and I think we have to remember it's not always up to us. For those of you who've been through Econ 215, you have read Jay Richards' Money, Greed, and God, and he has the piety myth in there, and he says that it can't just be your good intentions that matter, consequences matter. So first, seek to do no harm. Again, sometimes these are worthy problems to deal with, but there are other options. So, as I said, I look at this through a pacifist lens, but it's not passive. Some of the things we could do is just not collaborate. So, in the 1930s, Denmark, under Nazi control, 95% of the Danish Jews were saved because the Danes would not acquiesce to the Jews being exterminated. They hid them, they sent them off in boats to Sweden, they did a lot of different things. None of Bulgaria's Jews were exterminated because the Bulgarians chose to resist. I love this quote from Michael Ignatieff: totalitarianism, not to mention ethnic cleansing and ethnic extermination, always requires a great deal of collaboration. So don't collaborate. Let's help people not do it. Be ungovernable. I'm going to skip past this, friends, and I'm going to leave us with a reminder about the solidarity movement that occurred in Poland. A trade union managed to throw off the weight of the USSR. They did it nonviolently. There was no fighting done, and the Pope also brought it up with them. So I welcome questions later. Thank you.
All right, now we're going to give each of our panelists 10 minutes to control the clock. You can engage. We'll start go in the same order. You can engage another panelist in discussion and question and follow-up, disagreement. You can simply reassert your own positions. You can ask questions of your other panelists or disagree with your other panelists, or agree and affirm anything that you want to affirm. So, Dr. Watson, 10 minutes.
To respectfully respond to my colleague, Dr. Shoemaker. He said that nation building, if I get this right, nation building is a failed agenda. It actually worked pretty good in Japan. Japan was conquering the world, spreading around Asia. I guess I could talk about the rape of Nanking, where over 1 million Chinese were at another genocide. I mean, they were pretty rabid, the Japanese were, until we defeated them. They had to surrender. Yeah, we had to nuke them twice, but they surrendered. And we sent General MacArthur in as a military dictator into Japan and instilled by force of arms American democracy, free markets. Today, Japan is a model of peace, tranquility, capitalism, productivity. Let's go to Germany. Hitler and the Nazis, rabid. What do you do to a rabid dog? You got to shoot him. You don't let him run around the neighborhood and bite your kids. Now, what did we do to Germany? It's worked. We turned Germany into a nice, peaceful friend. How do I know that? I'm probably the only veteran here. I was drafted for the Vietnam War, but instead ended up in Berlin with U.S. Army intelligence assigned to an NSA listening post where I listened to bug telephone. I was a spy during the Cold War. Listening to bug telephones of the communists. Now, of course, you know, the communism ended. The Russians are now our friend. They didn't need me anymore, so here I am as an academic at CCU. But since I'm probably the only veteran here, I've seen the Army, okay? I've participated in it. What about the Marshall Plan? That was, in a sense, all of Europe and other countries as well, we helped to rebuild them at the end of the war. And the Marshall Plan was a wonderful success. Don't call it a failure. Okay, so trying to turn around Muslim countries is a little more challenging than Nazis or Japanese. I guess so. He also said that aid to allies who are bad is a bad idea. During World War II, the only way we could have defeated the Nazis was to ally with the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. We had to make a choice, either help Stalin fight Hitler or help Hitler fight Stalin. Sometimes war makes for unusual bedfellows, should we say, or I don't know how to put that. Anyway, and now to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Durow. She said, if we don't do it, no one else will, so we better do it. Actually, if we don't do it, someone else will do it. Putin will do it. We pulled out of the Middle East, Putin moved in. Really, the Middle East is now in Russian hands, and we don't have much of a say in it. Russian hands aided by Iran. Hey, she also mentioned that I guess it was Shoemaker that talked about the poor Yemenis. But actually, the Saudis would not be firing into Yemen if Yemen hadn't already been firing missiles into Saudi Arabia. Missiles they got from Iran because it's the Houthi rebels, the Houthi in Yemen, who are Shia and got aid from the Iranian Shias to get the missiles. And by the way, if Mexico was firing missiles into America, what would we do? We'd fire back. I don't blame the Saudis for firing back. I know people die. I mean, a lot of women and children died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, too. I mean, sometimes war is hell. I mean, we try to avoid it, but war is hell. My esteemed colleague, Dr. Duro, also said, peace builds, actually she quoted Ludwig von Mises, peace builds, war destroys. I prefer a quote by Ronald Reagan, who said, peace through strength. In other words, if we act like Chamberlain and pull back, Hitler will want more and more and more. Instead, we have to be like Winston Churchill and stand up and say, no more. This is my line, peace through strength. In other words, weakness only encourages. Our weakness only emboldens, especially radical Muslims. When they see weakness, they conquer. When they see strength, they stand back. And they say, one day when they're weak again, we'll go after them. We have to maintain, in fact, the motto of the military intelligence was always vigilant. We must always be vigilant because there are people who want to enslave us, conquer us, convert us, and we have to stop that. What will happen if the Taliban win in Afghanistan? Dr. Duro mentioned, you know, it's not successful. We really have no choice. Because if we withdraw from Afghanistan, if the Taliban will seize Afghanistan. The last time the Taliban had Afghanistan, they gave safe haven to Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and they hatched 9/11 there. We cannot allow them to have a safe haven. What if Iran is, I think they're already halfway there, successful in building a global caliphate led by Iran. Now, if America says it's really none of our business, what will happen to the Middle East? We will have our caliphate throughout the Middle East. There will be a superpower of all the Muslim world united together, and that is their dream to do. Now, by the way, Osama bin Laden, after Black Hawk Down, anyone see the movie Black Hawk Down? Okay, we actually got into Somalia because the people along the coast were starving the people to death in a genocide in the interior. We had to get food to them, so the Marines came in, took the port, and started to try to get food into the people in the interior. Of course, we had troops there, and Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda also went there, and they were able to shoot down the Black Hawk. And what did America do when our Black Hawk was shot down? We ran back to America with our tail between our legs. And Osama bin Laden said, they'll run away. They have nothing to fight for. They're cowards. America will never fight. So then he hit us every year during the Clinton administration. We were hit with another assault. Khobar Towers, the coal. I mean, it went on and on. There was not a year where we were not hit by Al-Qaeda throughout the 90s. And then he hit us after Clinton was gone and George W. Bush was there. Boy, I wish George W. Bush was still around. I like that guy. Anyway, he says they will always run, and throughout the 90s we did. You know, another point was made, war is hell. And as a soldier, can I tell you, war is hell. But we're all anti-war. I mean, no one is pro-war. Unless they're a Nazi or something like that. No one's we're all anti-war. The issue here is, does withdrawal bring peace, or does standing up and drawing a line bring peace? If there's a schoolyard bully, he's not going to stop until we stop him. Our withdrawal will only hasten a return to more instability. It'll encourage those people who want to oppress, to have a response of hostile powers taking over. Once again, I go back to Chamberlain and Churchill, but I guess what I would like to do is close with a quote from Walter Russell Mead. He is professor of international studies at Yale, at least last time I checked, and he said, if we failed to deal with the terrorists, the global economy and the political order may well collapse into ruin. Billions will suffer in the ensuing chaos. In other words, we have no choice. We have to stand up for them. And you say, but look at all the people that will suffer if we go to war. I say, look at all the people that will suffer if we don't. I'm finished.
Is up next? All right, thanks. All right, thank you. I think I'm more relaxed this time around. It's a passionate thing with me. I really want a generation of a new generation of young men and women, bright people who realize that they're not selling out on fundamental, long-standing, legitimate, conservative, biblical principles. Foreign policy is clearly the hardest thing to navigate, especially as a citizen, because we're so far away from the facts, right? We're told a bunch of stuff. And if you watch American public opinion, historically we've been played. Regularly been played. Our government's been able to get every war that it's wanted, all right? And then you look back on it and you go, oh, well, that's the Gulf of Tonkin incident, right? Or, you know, Saddam Hussein really wasn't torturing babies there, or there's still great questions whether he had weapons of mass destruction, or the status of those, right? So it's really hard, and we need to figure out how to be wise as serpents, innocent as doves with these issues. But let me just comment on some of these points here, rather than to get all whipped up into a frenzy again here with my own material. Part of the problem is when you're using all these historical examples, unfortunately, history isn't like a set of paradigms, right? What makes history so very, very difficult, and why statesmanship and diplomacy is so difficult, is because whether you like it or not, what you're going through right now never happened before, right? There are echoes, there can be rhyming, but history is just always different. So you can throw around, you know, these quote-unquote paradigmatic examples that demonstrate your point, but I think you got to be really careful about that. So, for example, I like to call it the World War II fallacy, or the World War II enigma, or the World War II paradox. One of the mainstays of those who really want to argue for American interventionism is that World War II is kind of the paradigm for all conflicts, and Hitler is like the paradigm for all evil in the world, right? So on the one hand, here's the tension though, and here's, on the one hand, we want to celebrate those who lived through that generation because it seems so uniquely difficult and challenging, right, to take on what looks like a uniquely evil ruler. But on the other hand, if this is so unique that we're celebrating how amazing this is that we survived it, why does it keep coming up that this is now World War II all over again, and this is, you know, Hitler all over again? Saddam is Hitler, right? And what we're going to have is World War II right now if we don't stand up in Syria, right? So somebody tell me why on earth there was never a Hitler like a Hitler before the 20th century that we had to attack. And now every conflict needs to be understood through the paradigm of World War II and so forth. As for Japanese, the rebuilding of Japan and Germany, I think they really easily recognize vast dissimilarities between that and what we have with the Islamic world. I grew up in Japan. I know what Japanese culture is like. The Japanese are very, very different from the kind of tribalistic mentality that you have in the Middle East. In the Middle East, you have people who've been fighting each other. It's been a civil war there, very unstable, for centuries. And these people remember what happened 700 years ago to their great-great-great-grandfather. Well, the Japanese, with the Meiji Restoration in 1870, wanted to be Western. They're already wanting to be like us. There's also plenty of evidence that the push for this militarism on their part was really largely a part of some rogue generals. Manchuria, that they were doing things that their government did not want them to be doing. So you have some really funky stuff going on there, such that the average Japanese had no interest, really, in conquering the world. Now, I don't want to get into all the details of it, but they already want to be Western. And the Germans were Western. And trying to paint them, which we bought a lot of this British PR against the smearing against the Germans, but historically, the Germans have not been an imperialistic people. Even the Kaiser, he ruled for 25 years, and he never got into one single war. If you look at the history right before World War I, when, then Germany gets demonized, compared to other countries, Germany was in like 3 wars in the past century. And England's in 10, France is in 7. I mean, there's just a lot of strange depiction of Germany as somehow the quintessentially evil race, right, that just has this obsessive desire to control. So I'm going to say you can look at those, but those aren't really nation building, right? They already have a culture that's Western or wants to be Western. And that's very different from going into these places where there's this history of instability, different perspectives, and they don't want to be Western, right? Their religion doesn't want them to be Western. So I think you can even make some real straightforward, easy observations that show that we're talking about apples and oranges here, so that there are exceptions as opposed to easy rules of, yes, you can rebuild nations. The Marshall Plan is really interesting because part of my view of the need for restraint in foreign policy is that you can't really control this stuff. You think you can, right? Now, we don't believe in economic central planning because that's ridiculous, right? We're free market people. That's ridiculous to think that you can centrally plan an economy. But let's centrally plan the world. Well, that makes sense. Let's centrally plan the creation of the rebuilding of the society. Well, that's free market, right? That's real insightful. It's just this. This comes from my Thucydides studies. To start a war is to be kicking boulders down mountains. All right? So, good, you can get it going. Okay, so then start guiding stuff, right? Start guiding it. If you know Thucydides, Thucydides sets you up in this first book of his histories that says there's no way Athens can lose this war. There's no way any rational person who looks at power politics, who understands the principles of warfare, there is no way Athens can lose this war. And guess what? They lose the war, and they lose their time in history. They lose their empire. England went out of its way to join World War I. It was a war of choice. And it's not exactly that they just decided to be a vacuum. They ended up losing their empire because they chose to get involved in a war in Europe. So here's the thing. You may say we need certain things to be the case. We need people, right? The world's a horrible place. We need, but the fact that something is needed doesn't mean that it can be provided. It can be provided well, and that it can be provided without the destruction. I mean, that's a tremendous loss to lose the British influence in the world, right? And they've never recovered from it because they chose to get in a war in World War I. So anyways, I don't want to drag into all these historical details, but they're not a lick 'em stick 'em kind of thing, right? Where you can go, oh yeah, here's my evidence. I can throw Hitler on this, or I can throw World War II on, right? It doesn't work that way. One question I had for my new colleague, Tom Copeland, or two, I always am interested and puzzled by this, that there is an equivalence at the personal, ethical, or moral level of loving your neighbor, that somehow doesn't like violate categories by being applied directly to the political realm. You know, it's one thing. The thing about warfare is that it's not a one-to-one thing. It's not me loving my neighbor by shooting them. There are so many casualties and so many things that you cannot control that I think it takes a whole lot more to convince me that that command, which is given to individuals at an ethical level, really apply at the political level, and especially at the level of warfare. Okay, thank you.
Well, just a couple of quick responses both to Steve and Delaney, and then I'll try to answer Steve's question of one or two other wrap-up thoughts briefly. Dr. Shimmick, you mentioned that one of the problems with war is that it's incredibly costly, and talked about the size of the U.S. National debt at $20 trillion. I just point out that the vast majority of that is the product of out-of-control welfare spending for 50 or 60 years. Some of it is due to military operations, but the vast majority of it is not due to military. So I think it's kind of unfair to at least use that number as an indicator of the overall cost of warfare. Secondly, it's just kind of a question. I've never whiffed the winds of anarchy down at your end of the hallway, but you said nothing in the Bible says humans should take charge. And I'm just curious about, I mean, it seems to me that the creation mandate includes humans. I mean, if we're part of the created world, then the creation mandate that we have must include some role for humanity in governing itself. I'm just curious what your thought is on that. What is the role for government? And one or two quick questions for Professor Dura as well. When you say we should do what Christ wants us to do first, are you suggesting that what Christ wants us to do is primarily just, say, speak in parables? Is it caring for the poor? Or are there other things that Christ requires of us, like doing justice? And I'm wondering if there's more. I mean, you said that you're pacifist but not passive. So I'm wondering if you can say more what a more active version of, behaving like Christ would look like, beyond simply speaking. And you pointed out later the combat casualties due to the U.S. In Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. And certainly there are a lot of those casualties. But like I said, the U.S. military is very careful to follow the laws of war. And they're incredibly careful about targeting and what's called discrimination between civilians and non-combatants and combatants. And so it's true that there are a lot of civilians who are killed in these operations. But the question is, how much of the time is that because the U.S. is just negligently just dropping bombs everywhere, which they do make mistakes. But in a lot of cases, as when Israel has gone into Lebanon several times and Gaza, when the enemy uses hospitals and schools as military bases, they're inviting those casualties. So I'm not saying that accounts for the majority of them, but I'm saying I think the casualty numbers have to be looked at a little more carefully. So let me respond to Steve's comment, that question of the equivalence of loving your neighbor at the personal political level, and I agree. I think it's a harder case to make, but I think that in light of a lot of the other commands in Scripture about the duties of kings and rulers to protect the poor, the fatherless, and the widow, it seems to me that that's another way of saying to love their neighbor, even if it's not using quite the same personal command. I think throughout the wisdom literature, especially a lot of examples of where God is requiring political authorities to do that.
Do you want to respond to this or no?
No, they'll just go ahead and finish up.
Okay.
I'll just take a second.
I just wasn't sure.
No, I agree with you. In international relations, so the problem is called the problem of n minus 1 equals 0. N is the number of cases of a particular, say, type of military intervention, but each case is unique. And so you can't say, well, if you look at all of the U.S. military interventions, or all the cases of free trade agreements, or all the cases of genocide, it's very hard to do that because they are unique. But I think using single examples of U.S. failure, taking out the Shah, the Iraq War, and so on, using single examples of failures are no more a guide to foreign policy than are the successes cited by Dr. Watson. So I think that there is that challenge of sort of projecting what U.S. policy should be based on any particular case. So just a final comment, and this will sound very familiar to some of you in my foreign policy class, but the U.S. has a long history in foreign policy. We've never been isolationists. We have a long-term tradition following in the lines of Alexander Hamilton, right? We have a keen interest in trade and open markets and free trade and freedom of the seas and so on. We have Jeffersonians, and I would kind of wave in that general direction if you want to identify some Jeffersonians. There's a concern to protect liberty at home. Like, we need to do things right here first before we try to fix things elsewhere. We should have a foreign policy that costs sort of the least amount of money possible. There's also a more Wilsonian desire to spread democracy, and that's kind of on this side of the room. A desire to take what we believe to be true, which is the importance of fundamental human rights and free markets, and spread those elsewhere. If we think they're really true, we should want to spread them, right? If we don't think they apply to other people, then they're not really universal. They're not universal human rights. They're just things that will apply to us. And it seems awfully restrictive and selfish to say, no, these good things only apply to us. They don't really apply to others. We also have, finally, and again, I'm repeating myself for the foreign policy class, but the vast majority of Americans are what you would call Jacksonians, like Andrew Jackson. And for the most part, they want to stay out of the world, don't mess with, don't mess with others, don't mess with us. But when they're provoked, they want to win big. So we don't want to go into, the Jacksonians don't want to go into Afghanistan and be there 16 years later. They want to go in and win it. And it comes from Walter Russell Mead as well. He says, we need all of these views. There's not one particular view that's going to steer American foreign policy on the straight and narrow. We need folks who remind us that war is expensive and costly in terms of money and human lives. We need people to remind us that war sometimes also prevents greater evils. And so we kind of need both of those. And unfortunately, that's not a concrete guide for, well, should we have gone into Syria? Should we intervene in North Korea now? Should we have gone into Darfur, for example, in the recent genocide there in the early 2000s? It doesn't give us a real solid set of rules for how to operate, but we have these traditions in our history that are very valuable to us.
So let me just respond real quick and then you go ahead.
Yeah, if you want to respond real quick.
Yeah, I'd like to respond if I can remember. Let's see. I'll revel in it. I don't. I'm not an anarchist, but let's see here. Oh, you had a question about take charge of the world, and that kind of gets into my interest with biblical theology. What I mean by that is this. My view is that if you look at the unfolding of biblical revelation, it's very clear that God's desire is for a multinational landscape. He rejects Babel for good reasons. Also, why I'm not an anarchist is I think the pre-flood state is an example of how we tend towards chaotic violence, and so we need that. Coming off the boat, we got to deal with capital punishment, etc. So the problem I have is I can't see, well, two things. One, so there's a legitimate role for government, but I don't see a supranational enforcer. What I see in the Old Testament is that God says, yes, kings of the earth, you do X, Y, Z, or you're going to be crushed. And guess who rules the nations? I do. So the idea that one of the nations is responsible, I see no evidence in the Bible that one of the nations is responsible for making the other ones toe the line. In fact, I see the biblical evidence is overwhelmingly the other way. Okay, so there's that. Oh, the idea that one of the traditions isn't interested in enforcing democracy or not of spreading democracy. I think that's a mistake. It's a confusion. In fact, the question is not a matter of the right ends. It's the question of the right means. So a Jeffersonian is very much interested, which I would align myself with, the idea that the world's a better place if you're very restrained. It doesn't mean you're isolationist. We've never been, and I'm not an isolationist. But you're very, very picky and very, very careful, and you really do follow just war theory, which says it should be the last resort, not the on paper, well, yeah, let's call this the last resort. The claim is that the best way to advance democracy is through cultural exchange, through economics, through peaceful means, right? That you're actually much further ahead. So I would put it this way. I would say that what's happened in the Middle East is probably, just taking a wild guess, but probably setting back democracy to, oh, I don't know, the millennial kingdom, right? I mean, what's the chance of democracy landing in the Middle East anytime within your generation or your children's children or children's, right? So I would say it's more like a ends means thing.
Okay. 10 minutes? Okay. No, I'd like to respond to a couple of things, and I think I'll start first with Dr. Copeland. It's a minor thing, and I think it might have just been my way of presenting it. I do actually think, I should put it this way, I do think that the U.S. military in general, by and large, does follow Geneva Convention and other even more strict rules of war when engaged. So I think what I'm attempting to show is that all violent, forceful engagement will result in loss of souls, period. So even when done well. Which I think leads me to something, I don't want to completely muddy the waters, but when in grad school I was introduced to a German writer from the late 1800s named von Clausewitz. And he writes a really dense tome that I will confess I did not read 100% of. I was supposed to, but I think I read like 80% of it. He wrote a book on war. He was a general, and he had really interesting theories. And actually, I think this is practically speaking, though I don't actually want you to do this, practically speaking, has a very interesting point about war. If you're going to go do it, you should do total war. Don't leave your enemy with a few limbs still ready to regenerate and start again. So if you're going to do it, you're supposed to do it so you annihilate your enemy. Now, as a person whose first citizenship is in the kingdom of God, I don't want to annihilate souls, period. Thus, I won't take that particular perspective. However, von Clausewitz's point there is that if you are not comfortable with total war, then all these smaller versions of intervention, of forceful intervention, all they do is stir up hornets' nests. So you have a great point. We shouldn't just use old history to apply to what is new today. And I agree with both of my colleagues who mentioned that. But I think the trend we see is if you're not going to annihilate the enemy, and I don't want you to, then what you're going to have is just a stronger, madder enemy. You're going to give reason for many of these things. I think much of the intervention we've done in the past, Dr. Watson, you said something about, ISIS sprung up. We have to do something with it. ISIS didn't spring up out of a vacuum. ISIS sprang up with a whole great, wonderful, fertile soil that we helped give them. So we've made them very upset. They have some rights to be upset. When it comes to self-determination, we're not so good at giving it to others or allowing it to others, which is hard, right? Sometimes when you're the sort of elder statesman, we're one of the older democracies in the world, it's hard to watch some of these teenage adolescent attempts, and we're like, hey, how about we just help you do it? But you all know that you don't like it when we do that to you. We can't do that to younger democracies or attempts at democracy or attempts at Arab Springs and things like that. In terms of what we do, because I think you're right. I left us hanging. I didn't use my 15 minutes well. As the U.S., if we're not going to use military intervention, sometimes withdrawal is not the only other thing we can do. I think we do remove ourselves from doing the harm we have done or potentially could do. I think one of the great things we could do, and this is highly controversial, so I'm going to just stir up my own hornet's nest right now, practice radical Christian hospitality. If the state has a certain amount, secular state has a certain amount of role, especially a state where a whole lot of the people voting, the people of this government in these United States, a bunch of us actually are attempting to follow the precepts of Jesus Christ who actively promoted justice. He did not just speak in parables. He was so active in promoting justice that he died. So if we're not ready for that, we can't do that. Before death comes a whole lot of other actions, and that is, why don't we welcome these strangers? Let's starve the oppressors. Get the people out of Syria, welcome them in. Let's send ocean liners. There's cruise lines that we can send to the Mediterranean. Let's get people out. The oppressors don't have much if they have no one to oppress. Right, so we could get people out. Will some of us die doing it? Absolutely. And there are so many brave soldiers in the United States who are ready to die. Let's give them an opportunity to do so much good with that, as opposed to also having to be ready to kill all the time. So that's some of the things I think we could do. I realize it's radical, it's messy, it will change the face of the nations we live in. So ethnic conflict will start to become a thing we have to deal with. So all of these things are messy. I don't think any of this really works super well without Jesus. So I think really Christians have to lead this, and we've done this before. We stayed behind in Rome when there was pestilence, and we served the sick, and we died. I think we have to be prepared to protect to the point of death, to welcome to the point of serious uncomfortability, like, you know, share your 4-bedroom home with 16 people. Have you read about what's happening in Florida? Puerto Rico is emptying right now because the electric grid is still not up, and there are so many families in Florida that are taking in people. They're in 2-bedroom apartments with 9 adults and 3 kids. And that's what we're going to have to do. It will be deeply uncomfortable. People will still die. That is true. Dr. Watson, you're so right. People are suffering. We can't do nothing. But it is not weakness to do some of these other things. It is still strength. We can still project strength. I think we can just do it in a different way. And I do think we still have to be prepared to die, but we have a really great model for that. So I think I'll just leave it to the questions.
Can I get a 30-second response? Sure.
Thank you. She made the comment, my esteemed colleague, that ISIS sprung up in the fertile soil that was prepared by the United States. But can I tell you that ISIS was only doing what Islam has done for the past 14 centuries? Well over 1,000 years before there was a United States, there were groups like ISIS that were performing jihad throughout the Middle East. I don't know if you're aware of it, but over 90% of Iraq was Christian at one time. Over 90% of Syria was Christian at one time. The minority were Jews. But Muslims started pouring out of what is now Saudi Arabia 14 centuries ago. Now, I guess the Christians were hospitable to them because many of them just welcomed the Muslims in thinking everything's fine. Maybe it's better than the Roman Empire that was here before. And they were hospitable. They ended up being slaves, dhimmis. Look, what has happened to the Christian community now? Are they still over 90% of the population? My point is that hospitality and diplomacy without credible use of force or the threat of force is just a bunch of hot air.
Okay. We have now 15 minutes for questions. So what I'd like you to do, if you want to pose a question, you need to pick a table that you want to pose it to. So if you want, it's going to be 2 lines, one here and one here. We'll go back and forth. If you want to pose a question to this table, you can line up here. If you want to pose a question to this table, you can line up here, and we'll go back and forth. And please don't make speeches or engage in debating the panelists. Just simply ask your question.
So my question is, this table, Dr. Watson, Dr. Copeland, you defended hegemony many times, or at least a larger interventionist force. And while there might be many examples of that working well in history, I think of the Pax Romana, the Pax Britannica, even the Pax Mongolica, and of course...
Pax Americana.
Exactly, the 4 Paxes. Those worked somewhat well. At the same time, though, I think of the Concert of Europe that Metternich and Castlereagh set up after the Napoleonic War, which also worked for 100 years. And it wasn't based on hegemony. It was a period of great peace. It was the Victorian period. There wasn't a lot of warfare. It was very peaceful. And so I'm wondering if you think that a more balance of power system, not multilateralism through something like the UN, but a balance of power system can offer a more peaceful alternative to hegemony. Thank you.
Metternich was most concerned about radical revolutions like the French Revolution happening again. It was after the French Revolution and Napoleon. They didn't want another French Revolution and Napoleon. So, but by the way, they were also called the Fire Department of Europe. Why? Because throughout Europe, wherever a revolution began, the Parisians took to the barricades again. There were wars. In fact, the Russian army, the Prussian army, the Austrian army, they put down these, they made sure that all of these fires that started bursting up in major cities where leftists wanted to take to the barricades, they were crushed and shot. Remember Les Miserables? You can say the Concert of Europe, but you can't say it without saying the Fire Department of Europe as well.
I would just add one other note from, again, going back to Walter Russell Mead, who we probably should be paying royalties to for his usage tonight. He points out that even during that period, you could call it the concert of Europe, but fundamentally it was the British hegemon that was controlling the rest of the world, and they were effectively bottling up all the scorpions inside the bottle of Europe. They were letting them sort of do battle with each other, and it was still British hegemony that kept the peace, and not really the concert of Europe.
So my question for this table is, generally I would agree with Dr. Watson and Professor Copeland. And so my question to your table is, as wonderful as your argument has been, what is your end goal and desire for people like us? And what are you trying to argue for what end? I mean, we can go all day long, but there's got to be some sort of end desire.
Oh.
Just pacifism? Is that the best way to say that? That's the best we didn't know each other's full position.
We didn't, so we don't have a
It's not a master plan.
I want Christians to have other activities that don't involve killing, and I don't think the United States should intervene militarily, period. That's, I guess, my encapsulation.
What I would like is for the American public, led on by evangelicals, evangelical Christians, to be very dissatisfied with any kind of intrusion into the internal affairs of other countries for whatever reason. I think it'd be great to be strong. My idea is be strong, don't spend it, right? If you have to spend it, you're actually not strong enough. So build up. I think it's great, especially to have a a Navy, an Air Force, but I don't think we should have nearly 1,000 bases around the world, right, with thousands of soldiers around the world. So I want strength, but I think we're just we're trigger happy, all right? Yeah.
Okay, so philosophical justifications for war aside, you talked a little bit, Dr. Watson, about soft power and sticky power and the implications that have for the way that we wage war. Should the United States be concerned or take into account the implications of unilaterally waging war for ideas that we consider to be just when the rest of the world doesn't necessarily hold those ideas?
I guess we should explain what soft and sticky and hard power are. Soft power is the power that America can exert across the world by getting countries to love us. I was a Fulbright scholar, lecturing in a former Soviet republic and trying to convince them that Americans are your friends, we love you, and they loved their professor, Dr. Watson. And another soft power is maybe Hollywood movies and rock and roll. The young people in many countries love America because they love American movies, rock and roll, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Okay? And what is sticky power? Getting them to depend upon us. Maybe I'm all for U.S. foreign aid. Why? Because we can always threaten to take away the foreign aid if they don't do what we tell them to do. And you say, why should we be interfering in the affairs of other country? Well, Cambodia, right outside of the capital, was a small town that was filled with 12 to 14 bordellos where there were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old girls. Missionaries found out about it. They tried to get the local police and the government of Cambodia. They wouldn't do anything. They had the hidden cameras. They came to Washington. They showed it to Congress, and Congress got our government to tell Cambodia that if they don't deal with the problem and end this horrible thing, that they'll never get another penny of U.S. foreign aid. They cracked down on it. Why? Because about 50% of the money that the government operated with was the U.S. foreign aid. Sticky power. Like a Venus flytrap. You get stuck, and we got them. And I would say, if we're a benign hegemon, that's a good thing because we've now ended trafficking. We could go on to hard power. That's if soft power doesn't work. If sticky power doesn't work, we send in the Marines. Did I answer that question?
Specifically for Professor Dura, so how do you balance the government's job to protect its people with what you're saying is that they should bring in refugees when we've seen the issues that has led to in Europe?
I'm assuming when you say issues that it's led to in Europe, you're talking about security issues. Oh, where'd you go? Oh, there you are. Okay, sorry.
What happened New Year's Eve a couple of years ago in Germany, the rapes that happened in Sweden, Nietzsche, the Berlin marketplace shooting.
Okay, so security issues, though, not just economic issues, is right. Okay. So first, I just want to split a hair and say that that's not all refugee issues. And secondly, just as a reminder that still when we compare European violent crime levels to American violent crime levels, America loses that one. So even when you don't have a whole lot of refugee issues, you can still have crime issues. So I just want to make sure we're not linking all things causally to refugees. However, it still has created a lot of instability. So I'll grant you that. I think some of that is, in some of the places, especially in France, radical secularism has actually led to an unwelcome culture, such that any public practice of religion is thus unwelcome in a place like France. And so if you are a religious person of a certain amount of faith and you're going to do it publicly, you suddenly can't do it. It makes you feel unwelcome. You ghettoize. You know, all these things happen, and then you have this antipathy and well, that's not the right word, but violence against each other. So I see what you're saying, and I think maybe what we need to be more is comfortable with at least cultural pluralism in a way that is resilient, and we're not so afraid of things. I think, however, in saying all of this, recognize that we will still have problems. I don't think there is a single solution out there that leaves us perfectly safe, because actually freedom isn't all that safe. Freedom is actually risky. So I think we will introduce different risks, new risks, but there'll be different risks. We already have risks. So I think it's worth the risk, but I do acknowledge that there's going to be problems in that.
You brought up examples of nations like Thailand and Vietnam who are asking for the U.S.'s help confronting China in the South China Sea. What about nations where not only the government but also the majority of the people don't want the United States involved, but they're still an oppressive country? Should the United States' perception of justice trump those people's right to self-government?
I'm taking every one. I hope you don't mind. If a country wants our help, we help them. They walk into the Venus flytrap and they get stuck. They become dependent on us, and we use sticky power. The fact is, yeah, we'll help them when they get used to that help. I mean, the same, you depend on your parents maybe for some support at college. They can say, I'm going to stop supporting you if you don't, and you comply. Sticky power there too. So I would say, yeah, we'll help you, but there'll be strings attached.
Well, I would add, I think maybe an example of what you're talking about is Syria, where the Assad government certainly would not have wanted U.S. military involvement, and the majority of Syrians probably wouldn't want U.S. involvement either. But there's a genocide going on against Christians and Yazidis and other minorities in Syria, and so, yeah, I think we had. Now, what do we do with it now that we've made it that it's been made a mess of? I'm not sure what the right solution is now, but we certainly had, I would say, the moral responsibility to do something, especially when we said there's a red line in the sand, Assad, you can't use chemical weapons on your own people, and then he walked right through it, we did nothing. So that's an example of where, right, it's hard, and back to my point about prudence, would U.S. military intervention 5 or 6 years ago in Syria have forestalled the death of 500,000 people? Probably so. It's hard to go back and Monday morning quarterback that, but that's an example of, I think, what you're talking about, where, right, the majority of people probably didn't want us and the government didn't want us, but there was still, horrible acts of aggression against innocent people, and we had a responsibility to do something about it.
I want to say also that I'm not as anti-Assad as Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. Why? All the Christians in Syria back Assad. Assad has not killed Christians. Assad is protecting the Christians. He too is an ethnic minority in there, and all the minorities support him. Who were really the ones killing the Christians in Syria? The people that Hillary and Barack Obama were arming.
Thank you. we'll allow for these four to ask their questions, and then we'll be done for the evening.
Thank you. Well, incidentally, I think I have the inverse question to Jansen. You talked about young democracies that may not appreciate our interference. However, in a few situations throughout history, a young democracy or an attempt at independence has invited our assistance. How do we hold to pacifism in light of a situation such as in 1956 in Hungary, when an attempted independence from the Soviet Union asks for our assistance?
But there's other answers there too. So I would say I think we encourage. I don't think we don't help. I think we're still friends. I still help my friends. I think this is sometimes the problem with sticky power or hard power. It's useful in certain kinds of relationships where there's an authority differential. But once there's not an authority differential, I think we act as partners. So I don't. For my adult friendships, I don't sort of say, like, if you don't do this thing that I really think you ought to do, I'm going to withhold my friendship, or I'm not going to buy you dinner, or whatever it is. So I think we have to be careful how that works. And so once we have this sort of this peer partnership, I think one of the things we do is we encourage them towards other options for achieving democratic growth. And it has happened in a lot of countries. There's some really, if I had time, I'd tell you stories about Liberia and some other interesting examples in Africa that have been done without violent revolution in the end. And so we don't always have to help them on a violent end. We can go help them, and we can help them with training. We can help them on, I love the public diplomacy. I mean, we can do education. We can be friends. We can say, hey, listen, we'll come stand with you when you protest against certain things. Like, we'll just come do it with you. We'll just be a neighbor and be there. So I think, and we can also fund things. That's another thing. So I think it's just, we can still be friends. We can still come alongside when asked. We just don't have to always do it with force, and I don't think we ever have to do it when not asked, in that sense, or when it's not clear that it's needed. So, but there's other options.
Yeah. Whatever you want. Okay, yeah. So the other thing is that there's really a long-standing expectation. For example, you might have all kinds of freedom fighters, right, that don't want their regime. The question is, at what point are those movements legitimate? It's very difficult from the outside, right? Now, you can pick winners and losers, like we've tried to do with Ukraine, right? Tried to topple their regime despite the guy being elected, democratically elected. But it's a long-standing kind of principle that these freedom fighter movements need to be viable on their own. That's part of how they get justified. So for you to intervene is actually a mistake. All right? And so this is not just, some people that are mushy-headed about it. This is part, Peace of Westphalia, kind of a 400, 500-year understanding that states need to be treated in certain ways, right? So that would be one response. Seemed like there was something else here, but I don't remember.
Great. Okay, so I came up here actually with another question, but I changed my mind when we started talking about USAID, because I think I'd really like to hear some more of you expanding upon what you were talking about when we talk about U.S. intervention in these countries that are requesting or are in need of certain aid. How do we as Christians reconcile our desire to implement help and establish what we think is right with what morality are we establishing that with? How are we okaying with that? And even kind of broadening that, expanding it when we look at organizations like the UN and these broad overarching organizations that have multinational bodies that are using defense, those become really hard to handle. Those become really hard for us to see what's the problem is, because, I mean, when you have different ideologies of war interacting, trying to accomplish the same thing, you're going to have countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo interacting with our soldiers and just implementing completely different strategies of war. So how do we decide what that level of morality is when we're implementing help, and how can we be okay in creating dependency?
Thank you. I'm really going to mess with your minds. I've come across as a great hawk and warrior tonight, but I'm also a pacifist. I mean it. I'm not joking with you. We should not conflate the kingdoms. There is the render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Augustine had the two cities, city of man, city of God. Luther had the kingdom of God, the kingdom of man, the same idea. And that is, call me bifurcated if you will. But Christians should be pacifists because Jesus said to turn the other cheek and to love your neighbor. So I, as an individual Christian, will love my enemy, will be hospitable to them, because that is the role of the church. But the role of the state is to kick ass. Paul wrote in Romans 13, sorry, I used a bad word.
What's that again? I'm writing this down here.
Okay, don't tell my dean. Paul said in Romans 13 that the government does not bear the sword for nothing. But he told Peter to put away your sword. There's a difference. The church is on one level, the state on the other. The state is responsible for punishing evildoers. It's right in Romans 13. When there's an evildoer, they've got to kick ass. But we, as Christians, should be purveyors of the grace and mercy and love of Jesus Christ. So when it comes to NGOs, next semester I'll be teaching global engagement, where we really talk about how we as Christians can be involved in changing the world for the better through working in NGOs and other things like that. And my point is, don't conflate the kingdoms. They're two separate kingdoms. The church should not be lecturing to the government that it should not have war. The church should be on its level, reaching out and trying to save people, bring Christ, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give water to the thirsty. That's the job of the church. But the church should not lecture to the state, and the state should not lecture to the church, because we have a separation of church and state. You say, it's not in the Constitution. Jesus taught it.
So there's been a lot of talk about genocide tonight all across the board. What is the recourse for the United States when genocides happen? For example, the Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire that you talked about, when there is no option of getting close enough to get people out without military intervention, or there is no alliance to exploit to get compliance to have them stop this genocide. What is America's recourse in that situation?
Well, this is the thing. I think and no one's so far, when I've asked this question, has been able to really answer it for me. People think that because an army exists, that somehow they already have certain functions that they're obligated to fulfill, right? It makes common sense. But if you go a step further back, whenever you're sending somebody overseas to solve a problem, by what basis do you as a person obligate somebody else's father or brother, right, or son? What's the moral basis for you to be able to point your finger at them and say, you go die, put your life on the line? As far as I know, there's no one's been able to answer this, because that's what you're doing. When you say government's going to solve it, well, okay, you're using an institution that exists, but in reality, we really believe, I think, that all the powers that government exercise, all that authority, flows from the fact that you as an individual have certain rights. And government receives those rights through you having them. You can't give the government rights that you don't possess as a person, right? So on what basis can you point to your neighbor and say, yeah, there's a problem in the world, now you go sacrifice your life for it? I don't see how that flows or follows. So having said that, is there any kind of a solution? My approach would be, if there's a problem with genocide, then let's have people voluntarily enlist with other nations, and if there's a sufficient number of other nations who are supposed to be the civilized world to go take on that genocide, well then fine. And if you say, well, we might not win it that way, and there might not be enough people voluntarily going, well, maybe that's a problem, right? Maybe the problem isn't that we need to make sure professional soldiers go over there. Maybe we have to have a fundamental basis of moral authority, which means it's only possible if it is voluntary, right? it's interesting, the French Foreign Legion works on the idea that anybody who's basically a criminal can volunteer, right? Well, that's an interesting solution, right? So you want to rot in, jail the rest of your life, or would you like to go form something like the French Foreign Legion? You can voluntarily go fight genocides around the world. So who knows, maybe we need to just be a little more creative about this and not just simply assume that if the government exists, if armies exist, then we automatically know that we can tell them to do stuff and solve problems.
Can I just take a stab, though, at answering a question about, well, on what basis does anyone say go and die? It seems like, well, we live in a democratic republic in a constitutional system, and you're right, we have individual rights, but we've given over some of that authority to the government to do those very things, to provide for the common defense. And so I think we have already given the government in our Constitution, we've given them the authority to do those things. We've created a commander-in-chief who has the authority to say, you're going to go fight in this war. So I think we have the system. I think that is how the system works. We've agreed to be part of this covenant, social contract, we'll have a conversation another night. But we're part of a constitutional democratic republic where we've given those an authority the right to make that decision for us.
All right, so my question is basically, what should the United States be doing militarily currently to change and be more effective in their conflicts that they get involved with? Because there hasn't been a single example provided tonight where the United States has been effective post-World War II. The basic two examples has been Japan and Germany, where those two countries were able to reconstruct and basically come back to the Western world. But outside of those two, conflict in the Middle East is more intense than ever. Russia is getting more, is advancing militarily. China's advancing, and the United States is being incredibly ineffective. So if you guys do propose military intervention, then what should we be doing to make it more effective?
Well, I think there are a couple of places. If you take the Korean War, yes, we certainly botched things badly in the middle, but it prevented the rest of the peninsula from being taken over by the communists. There's one example, I think, in Korea. I had another example in mind, and I've completely forgotten it now. The military is constantly trying to learn, and they certainly, after the initial invasion of Iraq, they spent a lot of time, and Petraeus was behind a lot of this, really trying to understand how to fight more effectively. But it's complicated because you've got what they want to do on the ground, and you have what the American population will support, you have what the generals want, and you have what Congress and the president want to do. And so there are a lot of complicating factors in saying, well, this was a success or not a success.
I can't add anything to it. I think unless there's, do we answer your question?
I mean, I guess I would add the first Persian Gulf War, we stopped one nation from taking over another nation. We stopped Iraq from taking over Kuwait. So that's another example. Now, it was a very easy situation. There was, one army invaded another country. It was easy to drive them back across the border. It's more complicated in some situations than that. But there are examples of where we've been successful, I think.
Let me now say, I have one more word of instruction for you. First of all, for those of you standing, you'll need to engage privately with those so we can dismiss the crowd. I'm so sorry, so sorry, but you please stay and engage your friends. I want you all to hold on now. I want you all to give a very general applause for everyone. However, I would love for you. To everyone generally applaud for each one, but if you hold, this isn't working. But if you find yourself in special agreement with we'll go individually, give a special rousing applause on your part, and then we can kind of gauge where you are as an audience. Okay, so let us applaud Dr. Bill Watson, please. Thank you. Let us applaud Dr. Tom Copeland. Let us applaud Professor Dura. And let us applaud Dr. Shoemaker, please. All right. Very good. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Please stay and linger and engage our panelists with more questions if you have them. Thank you.